everyone. Thanks for joining us for another Casual Stats. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Dr. James Steele, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about power and studies and see where things go from there. So, James, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I guess the brief background for me is I did my undergraduate degree in applied sports science. God, a very long time ago now. It feels like nearly 20 years ago. And then went into a Ph.D. that was more clinically oriented. So that was focused around resistance training and low back pain. And since then, most of my work has been kind of focused around resistance training substantively. But if anyone takes a moment to just scan my kind of publication list, you'll see that I've been all over the place in terms of substantive research as well. And a lot of that has stemmed from my kind of interest and expertise and experience in methodology, research methods, and statistics in particular. So you end up in high demand in sport exercise related fields once you show an above average aptitude in those kinds of areas.
It does seem that way. So if we're talking a little bit about power in studies, I think a lot of people understand power seems to be a necessary part of a study. Can you define for us what power is?
Sure, yeah. So most people will be familiar with kind of, well, they may not be familiar with the terminology, but most of the typical statistical inferential approaches that you see used in most studies. Not all, some use a different approach, which I'll maybe touch on in a moment. But most of those approaches are what are called frequentist statistical inference approaches, and they're based around error control. So they're based around trying to control the rates at which you might make either type 1, so false positive claims, so claiming that there is an effect of a particular magnitude or whatever, when the reality is that there is no effect, or type 2 errors where you may fail to claim that there's an effect when the reality is that there actually is. So most people might be familiar with this in the context of like sensitivity and specificity when it comes to screening or diagnostic tests and things like that. So it's the same kind of thing. We're trying to control the error rates at which we make claims about effects, scientific claims in the studies that we're performing. So power is specifically related to that type 2 error rate. So it's essentially the inverse of that. So when we say, for example, a lot of studies will, in our kind of area, target what we call a power of around, say, 80%. What that means is that for a given effect size, so magnitude of effect that we might be interested in for either practical reasons, or it may even be a theoretically predicted effect that we think, given a certain theory about the thing we're studying, that we should expect an effect of a particular magnitude to occur. If that were indeed the case, what would be the probability that we would actually detect that effect, detect a statistically significant effect in our study? So it's determined by both the obviously the selection of the effect that you want to be able to detect, also the alpha level, which would be your type 1 error rates that you set as well, which typically in the field is set at a kind of 5%. So we allow a kind of 5% type 1 error rate is the tradition. It can be questioned as to whether that's an appropriate selection or not, and there's a lot of debate around that. And then we typically allow what we would call a 20% type 2 error rate, which the inverse being if it's a 20% error rate of making a false negative claim, then that means we've got 80% probability of actually making the correct claim, if there is indeed an effect. So
Can I ask why there's such a difference between the error allowed for a type 1 versus a type 2? Like it wouldn't be a 95% power?
So That's a really interesting topic. So the selection of them mostly comes from tradition, and the discrepancy between them really, well, if you were to sit and think through this very carefully, you would do a very careful kind of cost-benefit analysis of what are the costs of making a false positive claim versus making a false negative claim in the context of the thing you're trying to study, which, as most people will be aware, people do not do when they're justifying the error rates that they use in their studies. Most people justify their type 1 and type 2 error rates just based on that's what the field uses. So it really depends on, like, it's this is where the cynic in me comes out and says it's largely based on tradition, not thoughtful application of it. But it kind of says that we think that making a type 1 error is a greater scientific sin than making a type 2 error, for example. So it's more kind of quote unquote sinful to say that there is an effect when there isn't, as opposed to saying there is an effect when there might not. Sorry, other way around, to failing to claim that there's an effect when there really is one. And the reality is you can play around with those. Reviewers might not like it, but most reviewers don't understand.
It's very true.
Play around with those. But most people in the field, researchers, aren't brave enough to go, do you know what? I'm going to set my error rates at this, and I'm going to justify them by these means. Maybe that's not strictly true. In some fields, they do that, but they're maybe in better positions to be able to apply some costs to the weight of making those kinds of errors.
Yeah. And I guess that is the nature of science, is that we want to be more skeptical. So we're more okay if we miss a true result than falsely claiming there is a result when there isn't one. So I guess it makes some sense.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it very much will depend on the context and the field. I think Matt suggested as a great resource when he was on recently, Matt Tanan, Daniel Larkin's free online Coursera courses and his online textbook, Improving Your Statistical Inferences. And there's a great chapter on error rates in there. And he also has a great chapter on sample size justification, because most people think of power in the context of what is the sample I need to obtain a particular level of power. So all of these things, like the effect size, the alpha level, the type 1 error rate, type 2 error rate, and sample size, are things that we can move around, and if you set 3 of them, then you can determine what the other is. So in most cases, studies will set a type 1 error rate, it will set a type 2 error rate, and they will select an effect that they are interested in for whatever reason detecting, and then they will try to determine the sample size they would need to be able to achieve that level of power given that type 1 error rate and the effect size that they're interested in. So that will probably be where most people are familiar with it. And Daniel's got a lovely paper with the simplest title ever called Sample Size Justification. And in that, he does talk about this balancing of error rates and the kinds of things that can go into deciding that. And I'm going to completely mind blank on the correct terminology right now. So forgive me for a moment while I'm on my screen above, just looking up the term, because it's later in the day for me, and I'm trying to think of losing the term for the moment. But essentially kind of balancing those error rates given compromise power would be is the term I'm looking for, where you can think of balancing those rates given an overall error rate that you might be interested in trying to obtain. But yeah, for the most part, most people set their type 1 at 5%, their type 2 at 20%, and then they'll think about what effect they want to detect and try and determine the sample size needed for a study to be able to obtain that level of power to detect that effect.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So when you're reading a paper, because I see this a lot, and it's some sort of enormously large number that just happens to match the exact number of subjects that they had, how do you know, or like, I guess research-wise, like appropriateness, of course you want to determine that you have enough subjects. I also know a lot of people will sort of post hoc look and make sure, and then you can sort of be like, oh yeah, this is all we needed to find X effect size, sort of like appropriate steps for that, or maybe things to look for in papers to show that maybe they weren't sufficiently powered, or like take the findings with a grain of salt type thing.
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of sins in the literature when it comes to power analysis. It's funny because I have hands up made all of those sins in the past myself as well before I knew any better.
Anyone in academia has probably sinned.
Oh,
sure.
absolutely.
Yes.
You know, we're all going to academic hell at some point. Yeah, things to look for, I guess. It maybe the first thing to think about is like what would be from my perspective, a really high quality study where I'm very confident that the study was well designed and adequately powered to be able to test a effective substantive interest. You know, whether that is a smallest effect size of interest, or like I say, a theoretically derived effect size that they want to try and test. So most people nowadays, most researchers realize that like they can't get a study published, or it's harder to get a puppy published. You can see what I mean. I've been painting the porch today, so maybe it's the paint.
Nice.
They realize that they have to include a power analysis now, or really they need to include some sort of sample size justification, which doesn't have to be power based. Let's just be clear. But most people think that they need to include a power analysis now. So it's become a little bit of a kind of
Hawthorne effect.
Yeah, well, and the way in which it's done is very kind of cargo cult like. So for those who aren't aware of that analogy, Richard Feynman gave it was actually I think a graduation address, but it's been turned into an essay on cargo cult science, which is kind of things that look like science and have the kind of veneer of science to them, but they don't really achieve the outcomes that they're intended to. And a lot of power analyses look like this. So exactly like you say, like, oh, quelle surprise, you know, and it's normally the other way around. It's not like there's a really big study and the power analysis determined that they needed just that many participants. It's normally a very small study and saying like, oh my god, quelle surprise, I only needed 10 people for this study. Well, isn't that fortunate?
Counting dropouts.
Didn't recruit more than that.
Yeah, seriously. We had 2 dropouts and we got exactly 10.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I get it. Like in the context of most studies being conducted within kind of academic institutions, there are resource constraints that make it very difficult to do that, to actually do a power analysis properly. A lot of the time, the researchers will either not understand and then do it wrong, or they'll go speak to their statistician, usually, which, you know, in my life recently has been me, and I'll sit there and say, work through all of these questions. Okay, what's the type 1 error rate you want to keep? What's the type 2 error rate? What is the effect size that you're interested in? And then from that, we can, given your study design, determine how many people you would need to control those error rates. And they're normally very disappointed in what the number of participants I tell them is, because it's normally way more than they wanted to or think they're even able to. So then I get questions of like, oh, well, can we tweak this and can we tweak that? And I'm like, well, no, you said these were the things that you thought were important, and this is what I'm telling you need. But anyway, so I'm always very cautious when I read a study, and it's a very small study, particularly in an area where I know effects to be very small, and they, you know, like I say, just by coincidence happen to have somehow justified them needing a very small sample size, because given type 1 and type 2 error rates are fixed, smaller effect sizes need far larger sample sizes to be able to detect them controlling those error rates. Very large sample sizes in our fields are typically very uncommon for the kinds of questions that we're interested in. Most of the time, all of the big effect sizes are pretty well established. So like in my field, like lifting weights makes you stronger. And that's a pretty large effect. We don't really need more studies to tell you that lifting weights makes you stronger. But when we start to get to questions of like comparisons between interventions and the magnitude of the difference in effects that they have, particularly for things like, you know, clinical outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, and things like that, where we should be expecting small effects. And so we typically need larger sample sizes to be able to detect them, all else equal. So one of the things that I always look for is, like I say, most people don't necessarily justify their error rate. So I kind of let that slide out. So, you know, they'll stick with a tradition. Maybe nowadays some people might push the type 2 error rate down a little bit, so they'll increase their power to, you know, say 90%, maybe 95%. but I'll look for some justification for the effect size that they've selected to determine their power, do their power analysis to determine their sample size from. And one faux pas which most researchers make is to select an effect size that has already been reported in, say, a previous study. Now, one of the reasons why that's a problem is that there are a number of other kind of questionable research practices that occur in the field. Most people will be aware of something called publication bias. So, most studies you pick up just happen to report significant findings. And it would be incredible if that were actually the case, because it would mean that we're either selecting hypotheses to test that have a very high prior probability of being true in the first place. But more likely what is happening is that we are either not publishing the null results that we find, and we're favoring publishing the significant findings that we find, statistically significant findings. And then also maybe editors and reviewers are more likely to accept papers that show statistically significant findings. And so you get this filtering effect where you have more significant findings in the field. Well, what happens is if the real effect is actually zero, if there's really a null effect, or it's a lot smaller than you think it is, then in order to get a statistically significant effect with the typical kinds of small studies that you have in the literature, the study has to, just purely from sampling variation and all of the other sources of variance that go into it, happens upon a large effect size in that sample. And so you get this kind of filtering effect where the magnitudes of effects that we might see in the literature for a given area might be slightly overinflated compared to what the true effect size might actually be. And we don't necessarily know what the true effect size is, but just through that mechanism, you can start to get inflated effect sizes. And so what happens with the power analyses is an author will go, well, this previous study found this effect, so I'm going to try and power my study to detect that effect. When really that effect that they're basing their study on is probably already an overinflated estimate of the real effect size anyway. And so then their subsequent study is even less well powered to be able to detect what might likely be the small true effect. So you have that kind of problem. So I always look for like a stronger justification than that for the effect size that they power their study for. And there are two kind of key things which I look for in this. One, which is if there is a strong theory about what the magnitude of effect should be, and that theory is used to kind of derive a particular effect size, then that's a really good justification for powering a study. The reality is in most areas of sport and exercise, we're not quite at that level with our development of theories to be able to make those very precise predictions. Outside of a few areas, are we able to do that? Normally, the best we can kind of say is hypothesize that this intervention might be better than that intervention, but we're not quite sure how much better it might be. So instead, what we want people to do is fall back on, well, what is the smallest effect that would actually be worth caring about? Like, what's the smallest effect size of interest, where if the real effect actually were less than that, it wouldn't be big enough to care about. So in the context of kind of intervention comparisons, it can often be, well, how much bigger would the effect need to really be given, I don't know, the cost of this intervention versus that intervention, or the amount of resources or time it takes, or, other maybe adverse event rates or things like that. So that you can then say, well, the smallest effect we care about is this. Anything less than that, we don't care about detecting. But we want to be able to detect an effect if it's at least this big. So I always look for that justification for what the effect size they've selected is. And then the other thing I tend to look for as well is, and this is, again, becoming more common now, is that the sample size that they've justified through that kind of power analysis has been pre-registered prior to the study being conducted. And so it's not kind of, like you say, a kind of post-hockey kind of, well, this is how many we got, let's do a post-hoc analysis where we tweak around those error rates and the effect size and say, well, we were planning to try and detect this magnitude of effect all along. So kind of calling their shots, so to speak, and doing their power analysis and sample size justifications, and then pre-registering that before engaging in the study, that is a strong indicator for me that it's a well done sample size justification.
Yeah, I have a question too. So I'm working on my dissertation now. So of course, before I started collecting data, did similar things using the little G-Power calculator to, see how many subjects I needed, which, of course you're like, oh God, 70, that's just not going to happen. Is there ways in which you could tweak which statistical analysis you could conduct if you say we're like a few people short on what your initial statistical plan was? Like maybe you can't do a multiple linear regression, but you could do correlations. Maybe you're just not speaking as much to, you're not overstepping your statistical analysis of the data, but with your sample size, maybe you could say other things with the sample that you do have. Because I've noticed like when you do different types of analyses, it can change, how many predictors you have or how many, variables you want to include in your model. You could maybe parse some of that down to, I don't want to say fit, but if you're maybe not going to hit 50 people, maybe you have 30.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so you can also affect, so in the context of kind of power, as I've discussed it there, it's assuming a given kind of study design. So once you've got your study design set, then you can, and a particular hypothesis you want to test or effect you want to estimate or whatever, those are the kind of 4 things you can tweak around: error rates, effect size of interest, and sample size. But outside of that, it might be that there are other ways in which you can improve the power of your tests. So even sort of taking a step back before getting to what the actual what we would call kind of like statistical estimator, the statistical model you use, could actually be things like measurement error will contribute to the power of a particular study to be able to detect a given effect. So if you have an outcome measure that you are using that has a high measurement error to it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't detect the effects. It just means that you will need more observations to be able to detect that effect. Because when we're trying to detect any kind of given effect, whether it's an intervention effect or a comparative effect between interventions, or we're trying to, estimate a causal effect, or, if we go back to Matt's consideration, if we've got an appropriate kind of causal model and we're taking a parameter within a regression model where we've adjusted for other covariates appropriately to kind of explain away some of that additional variation, the more we can reduce the amount of noise in the analysis, the stronger the signal becomes. And the stronger the signal becomes is kind of that power component of it. And so, to use the kind of causal analysis example there then, including additional covariates in the model that explain some of the error terms, some of the additional variance that you get in the data, but do not buy. Have I just lost you guys?
Oh, I'm still here.
Oh no, sorry, my screen
you just
blew up, and I was like, wow,
you got big on my screen too, and I was like, did I disappear?
I'm sorry, I'm playing with things on the other end. That's all.
Oh, right. I thought it was because I was filibustering.
We just left.
Yeah. Like, wow, how's that boring? So anything you can do to kind of reduce that error term that is better. So that could be including additional covariates that explain some of that additional variance. But in the context of a causal question, you have to be very careful that those are not, you're not adjusting for things that then might bias the estimates of the effects of interest in that model. You can also addressing measurement error issues, so using more appropriate or outcomes which have less measurement error will increase the power of the study design, including covariates that are predictors of the outcome but do not bias the estimate of interest are also able to improve the power of that. And so to give a good example, within the context of, say, a randomized controlled trial, there's a number of ways you can statistically analyze that to be able to get at the effect of interest, which is the difference between the intervention and the control group, if we're thinking of kind of like a pre and post randomized 2-group control design. And so that's the effect of interest. It's kind of like the average treatment effect compared to, say, a non-intervention control or placebo or whatever. Well, in the context of that study design, there's a number of ways you can analyze it, but most statisticians will agree that an analysis of covariance, where you include the baseline values of the outcome of interest as a predictor in the model, as a covariate, is a more statistically powerful way of testing that. And that is because the post-study results, the post-test results, or even the change score results are explained in part by where people started. And so, but they don't necessarily bias the treatment effect per se that you're estimating. So including that reduces some of the, explains some additional variance that's not related to the treatment effect, and gives you a little bit more statistical power when you're doing that. So yeah, so using the right kind of statistical test, given the question you've got, can also impact that power as well. I can give you a good example of that, actually, and this is also a good example where we incorrectly pre-registered an analysis which was slightly less powerful to test the effects that we were interested in, which sometimes happens. You know, in hindsight, you look back at a pre-registered analysis plan and go, do you know what? Actually, we should have tested it this way. And so if you've got a good justification for changing your analysis plan, as long as that's transparently reported, then that's all good. And one of the things that we did was, again, going back to the randomized controlled trial design, if you imagine in a randomized controlled trial, you have a population, you take a sample from the population of interest, and then you randomize that sample. Well, in that study design, you might have an effect for time. So, what is the kind of general effect in both arms of the trial over time? You know, what is the average between those two? And then you'll have a fixed effect for the groups themselves, which will be a difference in kind of like their baseline values. And then you'll also have the interaction effect, which is the main thing you're interested in. So does the difference over time differ depending upon which group people are in? So if they're in the control or the intervention, or if it's two interventions or whatever. Well, one of the things is the more parameters you include in the model, that though can also, to some extent, weaken the power of the test if they're not the right kind of parameters. And so within the context of that randomized controlled trial, most people will throw in like full interaction effects. So they'll include like an intercept for the group, and they'll include an effect for time, and they'll include the group by time interaction as well. Well, but given that you've taken a sample from a population and they've all come from the same population, you don't need to account for baseline differences between the groups, because the only reason they're in one group versus the other is because of randomization. So you can remove that parameter from the model as well, and that also gives a little power boost to the study as well. So even in the context of kind of that analysis of covariance type design, you don't even need an offset for baseline differences, because they have all by design come from the same population. So yeah, so there are a few little, and you know, there's a myriad examples to be able to go through of that could, you know, we haven't got time to go through every kind of study design and that, but it just highlights the point that yeah, you can also adjust the statistical analysis that you're planning on using. The one thing I would be cautious of though is, I think in the example you kind of gave, Megan, you were almost talking about it a little bit more kind of post hoc, in the sense of, okay, I wanted to do this and I wanted to be able to answer this question, and I managed to, given my resource constraints, recruit this many people for my study. That's not going to be enough to be able to do the kind of error control tests that I wanted to be able to do at the beginning of the study. And that's completely normal in the context, particularly of like, any kind of dissertation related work. You know, you've got a fixed amount of time to do your study. You've got fixed access to a particular population and whatnot. You know, you get as many people as you can get, and you know, the more the better. But you put up with what you can get. Well, one of the things that you can do, though, is just be very, very clear in terms of what claims you can make and the nature of those claims from your analysis. So if you can do what's called a sensitivity power analysis, where instead of what you do is you say, this is how many people I ended up getting. And then you go back and say, right, given I wanted these error rates, type 1, type 2, and I got this many people, what is the effect size that I could have, the smallest effect size that I could have been able to detect?
Gotcha. Yeah.
So you can, those things can be flipped around to be able to say, okay, I can make claims about effects at least this big or greater, or this big or greater rather. But I can't make strong claims about smaller effects than that. Or you just be completely open and say, this is very exploratory. We're not going to make any strong claims over it. There are some potentially interesting findings here, but a well-powered study, an appropriately powered study to be able to test effects of, the magnitudes of interest that we kind of highlighted should be done in the future.
So,
yeah, that makes sense.
Question with that for a potentially underpowered study, whether it's self-declared underpowered or you read it and you're like, oh, this is definitely underpowered. The takeaways that we can have from that study, is that more just like, okay, that's a good pull into a meta-analysis, and does that work? Like an underpowered study, can that then be put into a meta-analysis where you boost the N number, and you're considering, well, assuming these populations are more homo or heterogeneous, and paying attention to that aspect of it as well. Is that something that you can use those studies for, or what?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And my kind of my cynical take nowadays is I pay very little attention to single studies in our field typically, because for given all prior evidence we have, the effects are undoubtedly far smaller than most people think they are. And so most studies are, for those effects, woefully underpowered as individual studies. So I tend not to get out of bed for them anymore. And my view on them is, if I'm being less than polite, is to just think of them as fodder for meta-analysis, essentially. So that at some point in the future, those studies can contribute to a robust meta-analysis to provide a more powered test of a given effect. And in fact, to go back to the sample size justification paper that I mentioned before, that is a justification for conducting underpowered studies, is to say, well, assuming you don't make any strong claims, it's a perfectly legitimate contribution to science to say, like, look, this is all we could collect. We're not going to make strong claims of it, but we're still going to report this because, again, we don't want to contribute to that publication bias, because where there is publication bias, then that can filter into the meta-analyses. So again, if you've got a literature full of overinflated effect sizes, and then you meta-analyze them, then your meta-analysis estimate is overinflated as well. Now, one caveat I'll say is it's very, very much field dependent and context dependent as to how much we should suspect there is publication bias occurring. So for a lot of the work I do, which is typically in kind of resistance training interventions, there is probably less publication bias because the studies are hard to do. It's hard to do intervention studies. It's hard to recruit people. And so come hell or high water, people will publish their studies, irrespective of what they find. Even if the findings, the results that they present are p-hacked, they play around with the analyses until they finally get that magical statistically significant result, or they've they'll just overblow the claims from an underpowered study in the first place. But I do typically see those as being good contributions to future appropriately done meta-analyses. In fact, this is the second time I mentioned this actually on the podcast, and I've not spoken to him about this, so I don't know how happy he'll be about me publicly mentioning it, but I think it's such a good idea that I'm going to mention it anyway. Good friend and colleague of mine, Franco Impilazzeri, who some of the listeners may have heard of. He is the editor-in-chief of Science and Medicine in Football. He's at University of Technology, Sydney. He's done a lot of work on, a lot of very critical work on things like the acute-chronic workload ratios. He's a strong proponent of sort of open and transparent research approaches, and has been a sort of like a strong proponent of incorporating some of the stuff that's come out of scientific reform and the learnings of kind of meta science, research about how we're doing research and improving that. And he's really put his money where his mouth is in terms of including things like pre-registration, registered reports, open data, open materials, open code, all that good stuff in his journal. Anyway, one of the problems he feels he has is he will now typically, unless a study has a strong sample size justification, and if they're testing a hypothesis and they claim to be testing a hypothesis, that means that they have to have a strong power analysis to support the sample size justification. If the study is submitted to his journal that doesn't have that, it just gets test rejected. That's it. You're not making strong claims unless you've got a well-powered study to do so. But one of the concerns, like I say, is people come hell or high water will get their study published somewhere. And so he feels like he's kicking the can down the road a little bit. So it will still end up in some journal somewhere with a bunch of overblown claims to it. And so one of the things he's thinking about maybe trialing is a new kind of publication format, which is exactly what we've kind of just described, which is to say, look, we acknowledge it's hard to do big studies, particularly in the sort of context of, academic institutions where they often get done. And so if a study is otherwise not flawed in its design, and the only problem with it is that they couldn't recruit enough participants to have adequate power, then he'll say, look, we can publish this, but we'll publish this on the proviso that what you do is you remove any strong claims from the study. The discussion of the findings pertain more to the kind of methods that you've been used, and the study is specifically published so that it ends up in the literature and can contribute to a future meta-analysis. And you have to make all the data open and all of those kinds of things. So I think a movement like that, if a lot of journals started doing that I think that would be a really good move. In the meantime, though, a lot of the smaller kind of studies that we see, assuming they've reported their kind of descriptive data correctly, even if you just ignore the overblown claims that they're making, given the sample size that they've got and the power of that study to detect effects of interest, they can still contribute to an overall meta-analysis. So like I said, I'll read a study, check the design's okay, and check the reporting's okay, even if I just largely ignore the author's conclusions themselves from their data.
Yeah, I've run into issues before, too, where I felt like reviewers wanted me to overstate I wrote something, and then people came back and wanted me to overstate my findings. So sometimes I feel like it's not even the author, it could be the journal or the reviewers who are trying to push you to maybe say things that I feel like are not supported statistically with your study. Yeah, that's a whole nother issue, but
no, absolutely. It's not. It's maybe unfair for me to say the authors, but it's a mix
it's them too. It's everybody.
It's the whole academic system.
Yeah,
and
I think it's the pressure to publish, and I mean nowadays it's so much more difficult. If I have a cross-sectional study, even if it's powered appropriately, bigger journals are moving more towards only wanting to publish meta-analyses and systematic reviews and editorials because it pushes your impact factor. So it gets getting harder and harder to publish those studies that will contribute to meta-analyses and systematic reviews in bigger journals, which is so bizarre. I don't know.
Yeah. This harks to a bigger problem in kind of particularly in as much as we all know impact factors are what's the PG rating on the podcast, because I was about to curse them. They're not quite the indicator of quality that they think they are, but academics even clinicians want to publish in quote unquote high impact journals because it's good for their career, because they know that search panels for job recruitment and tenure track appointments and even grant funding agencies, they look at those things, even as much as we've got things like the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which most of these organizations are signatories of. They largely ignore it and still use those heuristics. So I get it. It's very difficult. One thing I will mention that though is I think that we kind of as researchers need to, things don't change unless we just start to change ourselves. And so one kind of new publication format, or newish publication format, is something called a registered report. And for those who aren't aware of what a registered report is, I mentioned pre-registration earlier. So the idea that you pre-register your study design, analysis plan, sample size, justification, and everything beforehand. That is time-stamped, registered publicly, so that you can say, this is what we planned on doing, and here's the evidence that that's what we planned on doing. The problem you have with that still, though, is you still then go do the study. And if it turned out that there was actually a fatal flaw in the study that you completely overlooked, you then still waste time doing the study and struggle maybe to get it published or anything like, whatever. Whereas with a registered report format, and a number of journals have started using these formats, you essentially do all of that pre-registration component as what would be called the stage 1 of a registered report. That then goes off to peer review before you ever start doing any of the study. And then once that is accepted, where the reviewers will say, look, if you're trying to test this hypothesis or answer this research question or estimate this effect with a given level of precision or whatever, then the study you are proposing to do can do that. And we, agree that if you go away and do that, your paper will get published irrespective of what you've found.
That's pretty cool.
So that format is really nice. And a limited number of journals, I think, within sport and exercise and related sort of fields have them as an option at the moment. Journal of Sports Sciences is one, Communications and Kinesiology. But other journals which do publish in our sort of areas, so like PeerJ and a number of more medically oriented clinical journals offer these formats. Even better, though, there is a platform called Peer Community In, where the stage 1 registered report and the review of that happens outside of journals completely. And then there are journals that have kind of signed up to Peer Community In, such that if you have a registered report reviewed by the community of researchers and accepted, and then you go and do that study, then you've got a list of journals that will potentially then publish your study. And so you kind of get around this publication bias that might be related to results or like the sexiness of a given study or whatever. And the review process and the decision to publish is just based on, can your study do the thing you say it's going to do? Can it test the hypothesis? Can it answer the question? Whatever. And I think, the more we start to move to those kinds of approaches, then a lot of the problems we've talked about up until now kind of start to melt away. And also just that process of going through the level of detail you need to do a stage 1 registered report, knowing that that's going to be scrutinized by other researchers in considerable detail before you even start the study, makes you put a lot more thought into the study design as well, and makes you start to realize things which you might have overlooked had you not had that kind of scrutiny before starting.
So this is where
how long does it? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, this is where the cynic in me kind of comes out. So obviously, those are great things and can kind of streamline the process and kind of hold research to a certain standard. But where does the cost to publish kind of come into this? Where certain journals are charging certain amount of fees to publish, et cetera. Do you find that may influence how some of these things get kind of divvied up?
Yeah, so I think, so one of the things that I tend to, I'm a very big proponent of what are called diamond open access journals now. So just to explain the kind of tiering system for kind of accessibility of journals, you have different levels of open access. So some journals will will be what's called green open access. So if I write a paper and I publish it with a journal that allows green open access, the kind of sexy version, like the nice copy edited journal formatted version, might not be openly accessible. You might have to have an institutional subscription or, pay the ridiculous publishing fee that they charge for things, which is typically, well, we won't get into the
whole other debate. That's right.
Scheme of academic publishing. That could be another time. I can share a version of it. So I could, for example, upload a preprint version of it to a server like medRxiv or Sport Archive or whatever. And so it is openly accessible, but it's just not like the nice copy edited version. A gold open access journal, though, will then charge a fee to make that openly accessible. And they can vary considerably. So some journals, will charge maybe a couple $100. Some will charge, like Nature charges over $10,000 to publish an article, as though it costs that much money to stick a PDF on a website. Yeah. But Diamond open access journals are journals that publish completely open access, but with no charge to the author whatsoever. And there are a number of Diamond open access journals in most of our fields now. So I've mentioned a few like that I've either been an editor for or am an editor for. So Communications and Kinesiology is one, which is the official journal of the Society for Transparency, Openness and Replication in Kinesiology. And another that I'm an editor on is the International Journal of Strength and Conditioning, which is a Diamond open access journal as well. So authors can publish there completely open access. But Megan, I think you were going to ask the question about the timeline for things like with doing.
Yeah, so I'm guessing, like, say you submit your my brain is also glitching. Like your pre-study proposal, right? Like, and you're waiting for them to approve it. Is it like you can't start your study until you have gotten that pre-approval? Like, if they came back with edits, is it a back and forth, or it's just a yes, no? Because I can imagine, say you're kind of ready to get the study off the ground, and they have it for 3 or 4 months, and then they come back and they're like, no, maybe if you change a few things, but that feels like that's a long time period to maybe be delaying the start of a study. Or is it like you just roll the dice and hope they say yes and you just start the study?
So no, so in the context of a registered report, like you need to have not started the study before. So the stage one registered report, which is reviewed, which is like the study proposal and methods, that goes through just a traditional review process. So it is like a back and forth. And so this has been a criticism of the registered reports process, particularly in how it's been adopted by some journals, because it can put delays on things. And to be clear, not all studies are suited to a registered reports format. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, you're like we're planning a study at the moment, which we know we're not going to. It's kind of been a very quick thing, opportunity that's come up, and we know we're going to have to respond quickly and get the study going, and we know we're not going to have the time to do that, and so we're going to do a traditional pre-registration, but we know that we won't be able to go through that review process. Having said that, I mentioned peer community in registered reports previously. They have started to adopt, or they've included an approach which can, to some extent, address that. So they use something which most journals offering registered reports don't offer, which is what's called a scheduled review. So you might think to yourself, I want to do a particular study. You have a good idea of roughly what it's going to look like, but you've not kind of fleshed out all the detailed methods just yet. With peer community and registered reports, you can essentially provide, they have a kind of guidelines for this, provide a kind of 2-page summary of like what your study is going to be about, what it's going to be testing, a rough outline of the methodology, and then submit that to them and basically say, in 6 weeks' time, 8 weeks' time, I will have a full stage 1 registered reports detailing everything you need to know about this study, ready for review. And in that time, they will line up reviewers who will then agree to review that within a period of 2 weeks, so that you can have the review process scheduled and happen over a particular time frame, which allows you to then think like, okay, I know that I'll be able to actually plan starting the study at this point and have had all the methods reviewed and approved. Another kind of comment that people have made, though, as well is, and I was literally talking to a PhD student about this earlier today, because he was kind of asking, I'm trying to encourage him to do a registered report for a systematic review and meta-analysis that he's doing at the moment, or he's planning to do. And he was worried about like, well, by the time it's been reviewed, I could have done all the screening, done all the data extraction and all this kind of stuff. And, we can do a traditional pre-registration. Then, we'll be able to get it published quicker. The problem is when you get to the other end, as anyone who's who's been submitting papers at all recently, is there are so many papers being submitted to so many journals that it can take a long time to just get your paper published because it gets desk rejected, because again, going back to perceived impact, are the results the way they want it to be, and all of this kind of stuff. So although it's a bit more work up front in terms of planning, one of the good things about a registered report as well is that it guarantees a publication. Like if you go and do the study like you plan to do it, it will get published because the journal agrees to publish it before you've even started the study. So in some ways, although it's a bit more work up front, it then makes things a lot quicker at the end of it. And so in the context of like a PhD, it's difficult to do in certain areas. But there are at least a couple of examples. So Chris Chambers, who is a professor of psychology, and he was one of the first to kind of introduce this new registered reports format. Technically, the actual format was suggested like by someone back in the 70s in a journal article that kind of largely got ignored, who said, wouldn't it be good if we did science like this? So it took someone to reinvent it. But one of his PhD students, at least, did her entire PhD thesis with all the studies as being registered reports. So it is possible.
Good for her.
Yeah. In psychology, though, where it's a little bit, sometimes a little bit easier, depending upon the study design, to collect your participant samples and things like that. But,
PT's hard or rehab's hard because you sit around and you just hope people get hurt.
Yeah.
You hope they don't, but it's a little, you're just kind of at the
mercy of them,
whim of the universe at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm always jealous of people like, I went and collected all my dissertation data in one day. I'm like, oh. The dream.
Well, this is where also, like, one of the things I've also argued, and we've done a lot for studies. I'm always I've been a strong critic of things in the field for a long time, but I've always tried to make sure that I'm not one of these people who just moans about things and then doesn't either improve what I'm doing or try to actively improve what people are doing. And so, like I said, I've made sins in the past, and I've tried to, as I've learned more and then started critiquing the field, make sure that I'm not falling prey to those critiques myself. And one of the things that we've been able to do, again, for example, to try and boost up sample sizes and things and try and facilitate the studies that will actually answer the questions we're interested in, is collaborate more closely with industry colleagues. Because particularly in applied fields, there are practitioners, organizations out there who nowadays have access to huge populations of interest to us. They may already be collecting data on things that are of interest to us. And so whether it's the case that we can collaborate with organizations that allow us to embed within that context a study that will allow us to get the sample sizes we need and facilitate recruitment a lot easier, or it's the case that they may even have historic data, and it might be that you can do kind of retrospective work using that observational data. I know Matt briefly mentioned about using causal inference approaches to be able to draw those inferences from non-randomized observational data. All of those things can be kind of used to try and in the context of the kind of registered reports format as well. I think almost those two pairings for a field like ours is like the perfect kind of solution to address a lot of our problems. So I'll give you one example, and it's funny because I'm not a cricket fan, and I didn't understand cricket at all. But a colleague or an ex-colleague of mine at Solent is an international cricketer herself, and I had spent some time doing some research methods and statistical mentoring with her, and we decided to build a project into her learnings around that. And so we're doing some large-scale kind of causal inference using historical cricket statistical data. So I've had to learn about cricket, and she's had to learn about causal inference from observational data. But one of the things we said right at the beginning of starting this project was we're going to do it as a registered report. And we're going to plan out all of our kind of causal model, all of the kinds of analyses that we're going to do to be able to answer the causal questions that we have. And then we're going to submit that let that get viewed, and then all the data's there already because it's historical data, and we're also building in approaches to kind of avoid the bias of the fact that we could have technically seen the data already. So there's some interesting things you can do with historical data like that, where you can say, look, if the data is big enough, you might only actually need to take a sample of that data to be able to answer your question. And so you can kind of set it in and say, look, here's the study design. We've taken a small random sample to show you the analysis that we're going to do. But for the real analysis, what we're going to do is take a completely new random sample from that data set of the size that we need to be able to then fit those models. But yeah, like that kind of collaboration using historical data, collaborating with industry. We've done that with a recent large-scale randomized controlled trial that we've done across multiple sites. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that can be done. It's hard to do, but building those kind of connections can really help facilitate these things.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
You mentioned taking only a small portion of the sample. Can you be overpowered in a study?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there's almost an ethical question there as well, in terms of saying, there's been articles in the past that have kind of made arguments regarding, what is the level of power we need? And this is where, particularly in the context of a study where maybe the intervention is not particularly pleasant, or it may be dangerous, or there may be other ethical implications of doing that kind of study, particularly in injury context, for example. And so, there are questions about how well powered do you need to be, and this almost comes back to being able to justify your error rates based on kind of cost benefit analysis of what would the costs be of making particular kinds of errors. So how much do I want to weight type 1 versus type 2 errors, and the power of my study. So it's not a simple question to answer to say like this is just overpowered. But it's something to say like given what we're looking at, how much power do we think is appropriate for what we're looking at?
Fair. Yeah, and I guess somewhat related to that, power. When people calculate power, it's for one outcome measure, right? So like PTs will have, or studies, thinking of PT studies, they'll have a primary outcome, and then they'll also have 50 million other outcome variables. Power is just for one, right? The primary outcome.
So it can depend. So it really depends on what the researcher's kind of aims are there. And it also depends on what the hypothesis is. So for example, you could have a particular, I'll give you a concrete example for this. So in our recent study, our kind of construct of interest that we were interested in was muscle hypertrophy. And we measured arm and thigh estimates of cross-sectional area. So we actually had 2 hypertrophy outcomes. Now, we weren't specifically interested in thigh and arm separately. We just happened to have 2 measures of hypertrophy. And so although we only had one hypothesis, which was related to hypertrophy, we had 2 opportunities to test that hypothesis. So for that, we had to, in order to make control our error rates, we had to make sure that we adjust our kind of type 1 error rates appropriately. But it could, like I said, if you may have multiple outcomes that relate to different hypotheses. So you may have a particular primary outcome. Maybe it's a particular, maybe pain, particular patient reported outcome or something is your outcome of interest, but you may have other kind of functional outcomes, or other kind of clinical indices that you're looking at, or maybe even physiological parameters or whatever, that are all you're all hypothesizing will respond to the intervention maybe that you're looking at, but they're not the same hypotheses. They are separate sets of hypotheses. Now, there's 2 things you can do, which is to say, like, we're mostly interested in this outcome, and so that is our primary outcome, and so we're going to make sure that our study is powered to at least detect the effect of interest for that outcome. Or you can say, we're interested in this set of hypotheses, And so what we're going to do is we're going to think about which are the effect sizes of interest for these hypotheses, and we're going to make sure our study is powered to detect at least the smallest effect size within that set of them, which then by definition means it's also able to detect all the others with a given set of error rates as well. So again, to use the example in our recent study, hypertrophy was our main outcome, which is an outcome that responds that we assume the true effect size is a lot smaller in response to, say, a resistance training intervention compared to, say, the improvement in strength that occurs from a resistance training intervention. And we've got large-scale meta-analytic data that kind of supports that assumption. So just by definition, though, if we powered our study to detect the effect size of interest for hypertrophy, it's by definition powered to, at that same level or higher, to detect the effects of strength because the effect size is bigger for strength. So it really does depend. But a lot of studies will say this is the main thing we're interested in. We're going to make sure all of our resources can detect at least that. And then everything else, if the effect sizes of interest are bigger than that primary outcomes effect size, they are also well powered and we can make strong error control claims about them. But for everything else, we should treat them as exploratory. We won't make strong claims either way because we're not sure on the error rates. Or, again, you can go back to that, what we mentioned earlier, which is do a sensitivity power analysis for those results and say, for these outcomes, what could we have said about them?
Yeah. All right.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you, James. Well, we have reached the hour mark, so we are going to let you enjoy your Saturday, but we appreciate you spending part of it with us.
Yeah.
For the listeners who want to learn more about you, maybe read some of your work, could you maybe tell us where they could find you on social media, any sort of websites or initiatives that you want to plug? This is your time.
Yeah, sure. So, I do have a website, but it's largely out of date at the moment and needs to be addressed. So I won't send people there for the moment. I'm not on Twitter anymore, Twitter or X or whatever anyone's calling it, but I have popped over to Blue Sky. Still trying to figure that out, which I'm sure Matt said as well.
Yep.
So that I'm James Steele II. There's a reason for that. It's James Steele II because my father's called James Steele as well. So that's been a username that has stuck since I was in my teens. And I'm on Instagram as well with the same handle, though I think it's james.steele. Mostly on there, you'll get a mix of kind of rants about things and then pictures of my cat Kiki, who I'm surprised didn't join us, to be fair. She normally appears on our cat tower in the background. And then in terms of my research work, I tend to keep my ResearchGate profile pretty up to date. I feel like it's a sunk cost now. I'm kind of locked into that platform. Mm-hmm. So any new studies that we publish, I tend to also preprint all of the work that I'm involved in as well. So those preprints will be available on there as well. So any new work is always available on my ResearchGate if people want to follow me there and check that out.
All right.
Great.
Awesome.
Yeah, we can't thank you enough.
No, thank you for having me.
Awesome, guys. All right. So as the out for AASPT, catch us on our next podcast, YouTube. And again, thanks for your time, and thanks, James. All right, guys, have a good one.